Whatever influence I've had on the world, from my point of view, I've been having what I think are simple, nice ideas, throwing them out into the world, and mostly not hearing much back from the world. And then I hear about things happening. I think, well, that's good. And I hoped I influenced that, but I really don't understand how necessarily. So let me just describe my head, the basic idea, and then let's discuss it. So, context. Long ago, 40 years ago, actually, over 40 years ago, I left grad school in physics and philosophy of science to go out to Silicon Valley to hang out with people trying to create the World Wide Web. This was before there was a web. And on the side, I found a job doing AI because there was an AI boom at the time. And in this project of trying to create the World Wide Web, we had this vision that the way it would help the world would be to make criticism easier to find. So we thought we saw in the world a lot of apparent consensus that looked stupid because people didn't know about better arguments. So we thought when somebody said something, we would put a criticism attached to it in a way that would be easy to find, and that would make the world better. And so, of course, the web did happen. It has helped, but I think we reasonably have doubts now about that. And I started to have doubts in the late 1980s about this vision. And I asked myself, what else could we do to make conversation better? And then it occurred to me that betting markets, speculative markets, were an alternative way to make a healthier information ecology world. And if we could encourage more betting markets on important topics, then that would be valuable. And so I started to pursue that, talking with people about that, writing about that in the late 1980s. So at first, I thought of doing betting markets on the usual topics that are in the news, in public policy, in politician speeches, dinner party conversation. And as you can tell, when later on more people have gotten into prediction markets, that's the first thing they think of too. And that's where most of the activity even is in the last few years. And that's valuable. But I went back to grad school in 97, which then reminded me more vividly, reviewing, say, decision theory, because I was a social science, that standard decision theory has a standard account of the value of information. And it says that information is valuable as it directly informs decisions. That's where information is valuable. And I thought, oh, if we were asking what sort of prediction markets would be the most useful in the world, the most useful ones would then be the ones sitting right next to a decision advising what to do. Specifically, decision theory says, collect your options for each option, estimate expected utility, and pick the one with the highest expected utility. Well, then what you want is a set of options, and then for each option, an expected outcome that's relevant for that decision. And if you can get markets to do that, then you could directly advise decisions. And that would be worth a lot. That is, financial markets for a long time have achieved many kinds of value in the world. They let people hedge risks. They let people entertain themselves, prove themselves. But achieving information for decisions seems to me like just an intrinsically much larger value proposition. There's just a lot more willingness to pay in the world for better decisions than there is even for hedging or entertainment in betting and speculation. So that seemed to me the big long-term opportunity. Find a way to make these sorts of what I call decision markets. Now, as you can guess, when you think about sort of information on topics that everybody argues about, there's a common pool problem. Even if I want better information, why should I pay for it? Why not let other people pay for it? And then I'll just scrape the information they get. But if you look at an individual, an organization where they have a decision that no one else really cares much about, they're going to be willing to pay and know that if they don't pay for it, nobody else will. And so that seems to be just a more obvious business proposition to find people who want to make a decision, who want more information about it, and then just directly get them to pay to set up a market about that decision. And that was the key opportunity. So then basically 30 years ago, this year, I first wrote about this idea of decision markets as the big potential value. And ever since then, anytime I meet people who say, hey, prediction markets, cool, you're into this, and show me what they're doing. And I say, that's nice, but what about decision markets? And that doesn't always win me that many points with them, because they are always want me to be excited about what they're doing rather than this other thing that does look a little harder. Because here we have to switch the customers. Like most financial markets, the customer is the trader. That's even true for current prediction markets. And for the trader, you just offer them whatever topics they want to trade on, and the information generated is a side effect that other people may benefit from, but nobody's paying for the information really. So what we want is to switch the customer to be the person who's paying. So this idea, in terms of concrete examples, we've had betting markets on presidential elections for a while. So you can think of those markets typically give you a chance of a candidate being nominated, a chance of being elected. The ratio of those two is a chance of being elected, even nomination. That's decision advice to the party. And that's been happening for many decades now. In most election markets, they give advices to the party about who to nominate. In the last US presidential election, actually, two forecasting websites, Metaculus and Manifold, both gave conditional predictions if the president was Republican or Democrat of a number of key policy outcomes for the country, such as immigration, marijuana legalization, gas prices, Chinese invasion of Taiwan, just a bunch of things like that, which are in fact relevant. And that is an example of a decision market, i.e. giving people advice about their decisions. Of course, this has the problem that the common pool problem that why should I pay for this? Let somebody else pay to create it and I'll just look at the prices, but at least you see the general potential there. Imagine a conditional stock market. An ordinary stock market trades stock for cash. A conditional market would just be trades that are called off if the condition isn't met. And you could have a conditional stock market for a firm in the stock if the CEO leaves by the end of the quarter, or the stock if the CEO stays through the end of the quarter. Those two different prices would be advice to the board about whether to keep the CEO, which is one of the most important corporate decisions. And so that would be a concrete example. And I had a post a long time ago that said, if I had $1 million, I'd just pay to make that happen offshore or whatever, because it would be great marketing. See, if you got enough attention, business press would pay attention to it. The CEOs would actually try to manipulate these prices to make themselves look good, which would add liquidity, which would increase accuracy. And so that would be another concrete example. And you could imagine similar markets for most large corporate decisions. That is mergers, acquisitions, restructuring, raising capital. Any major decision of a corporation, you could just have market price that tracks the value of the organization of the venture, conditional on various key choices. So that's been this idea that I've been pushing for a long time, and I still think has this huge long-term potential, but it requires overcoming local and shorter-term obstacles. That is, you need to get real organizations to try these things. And turns out there are a lot of obstacles there. And that's been the main obstacle. So actually, the obstacle doing this for all these years hasn't been the law, because you can actually do a lot of internal corporate markets legally. And it hasn't been technology, because I ran an internal corporate market in the early 1990s at this company, Xanadu, that was trying to make the web long ago. And I did that with paper and pencil. And there's this guy named Jeffrey Wernick, I should give him credit, who in 1981 created a company that created finance simulation software, had it managed by this mechanism of conditional markets, where he chose who to hire and what features to add to his software based on these betting markets. After 3 or 4 years, he sold it for a profit. It's been a rich investor ever since. And somehow all his customers or employees didn't think to try this again somewhere else. And I had to reinvent the idea 15 years later.
As Robin said, the barrier to using prediction markets as a decision-making tool, it's not technical, it's not legal, it's cultural. Historically, when these experiments have been done at Microsoft and HP, where the internal prediction markets forecast project completion time, they're more accurate than the product managers. And so the leadership revolts because they don't like their authority to be challenged. It's probably pretty difficult to get a pre-existing large corporation to adopt this for the long term. What's much easier to achieve potentially is to embed the prediction market as a decision-making tool from the ground up at the very beginning of an organization. This is why I'm happy to announce that we decided to do this at Cassandra. We are going to implement our own internal combinatorial prediction market, because this technology, the iteration needs to be happening somewhere. And we're going to take this all the way. We already have our own play to earn prediction market that we use for social indicators, but we will start to use this for project completion time and complex decision making. I agree with you. I think that we need to show an organization massively succeeding because of the prediction market as an embedded decision-making tool to then get governments to do it. I think my long-term vision, right, is to bring this into decisions for government funding, is to bring this into
Absolutely.
policy decision.
In general in the world, governments don't tend to be the first movers in innovation. Like most government agencies, they follow standard business practices outside of the government, but they aren't necessarily the ones creating new business practices, organizational practices. So yes, if anything can be tried at a small scale privately, that's where it probably should be first tried and innovated, and then you can later on get the government.
Exactly. And I think now it's the perfect time because people are finally starting to realize that the nature of the firm has to change because of AI, right? There's so much conversation about AI native organizations, right? And this idea that how do you make Claude run the organization, right? We want to take the same philosophy into the prediction market context, right? Instead of just having Claude run Cassandra, we want our prediction market to help us run Cassandra because it brings a different kind of intelligence. If Claude brings artificial intelligence, reading a bunch of files, right? The prediction market brings the collective intelligence of the organization.
Ideally, these choices are modular in the sense that AI can train in the markets if it's good enough, and you don't have to decide whether or not they do when you design the market. You just design a market for whoever can participate. There's other experiments happen lately. 3 years ago, a company called the MetaDAO was formed, where its constitution was to use prediction markets, and it's been making roughly 100 decisions so far that way. There's a couple of other crypto-based companies that have been using this mechanism to do a couple of things. I could tell you about those. So I just want people to know that those examples have happened out there. But again, would you like me to go in the direction of organizational obstacles or technical obstacles?
Technical obstacles, specifically because I think that's going to get dovetailed nicely into why would a for-profit prediction market struggle to implement combinatorial functionality?
So conditionals don't really require combinatorial. That is, you can just make a pretty small modification for most ordinary market structures, and you can do conditionals just fine. But there is this opening to do combinatorials. I was part of a project over 10 years ago called Dagger, then Zycast, where we developed a Bayesian network-based combinatorial prediction market with exact updating probabilities and asset representations. And we had about 1,200 variables there where users could not only make edits that were consistent with the structure, they could change the structure. So that's a technology that's sitting in the background, just waiting for somebody to use it more. And I do think that's a moat potentially for a future finance firm. That is, I think the finance industry is just open at some point to somebody offering a combinatorial financial market, because if you do that, then customers will want to come to your market to do the combinations of all the things you can offer, which has some scale economies with it, which then lets you push away competitors. So here's the key idea. So imagine you have N topics that you have betting markets on. I'm going to do the betting market version. And for each market, you set up a market maker to trade on that topic. And you have a subsidy for that market maker, which produces some liquidity. And now you ask, I want to trade on all combinations of all these variables at the same liquidity that I'm trading on each of these particular variables. How much more subsidy does that cost to do all combinations in addition to just doing the basic variables? And the answer is none. The liquidity lets you subsidize all the basic variables is sufficient to do all combinations. There are computational and interface issues with doing combinations, but there are not extra liquidity costs. So that's a pretty dramatic claim. That is, for whatever liquidity you can manage for a set of financial markets, you could let traders do all combinations at the same liquidity. So that's showing you a big potential there in terms of what you can do. You might have thought, well, you've got N markets, you've got 2 to the N combinations, you'll have to have this exponential explosion in the liquidity that you're paying for to do all these combinatorial markets, but it's just not true. So that's a technical issue. But so if we think more specifically though about these conditional markets, there are a set of technical issues to consider. So one issue, of course, is just that you'll have to have some agenda process for making proposals. And so this is a way to choose when you have choices fixed in front of you. You will want to subsidize these markets somewhat so that they give you advice to inform your decisions. But you'll also maybe want to consider what process you use to create proposals. And for example, at the MetaDAO, they've made this choice that I'm not entirely happy with, but they decided that if you're not the CEO, your proposal has to be 3% better than the status quo to be approved. But if you are the CFO, your proposal can be up to 3% worse than the status quo and still be approved. They're giving the CEO a 6% differential on making proposals. You can see that's an issue of what threshold to set, whether it's advisory and whether it's directly in control, who's allowed to make proposals, and then at what sort of threshold. And I like the idea of, say, letting anybody make a proposal, but you have some sort of auction for each proposal slot. What proposal is going to be considered? Whoever wins that thing has to pay an auction. But now, if their proposal is approved, they get some cut of the improvement because the market will actually give you a direct value estimate of how much value is being increased by a proposal. That's the value if yes versus value if no. And so that's an idea for a more open competition process, but that does require that you trust these prices a bit more. The MetaDAO basic thing is we just trust the binary yes, which one higher than the other, but they don't much trust the size of the difference. So the question is how much you trust those differences. One technical issue is that if the market is advisory, for example, Gnosis recently gave a budget for someone to do some advisory markets, but then they set up internally where basically they never really publicize any proposal being considered until they're pretty sure it's just going to happen, in which case the market doesn't really have much to say. They made sure that they keep the real times when options are really open and things are possible hidden so that the market doesn't speak to those. But in an advisory market, there's a potential for what I call the decision selection bias. So if you imagine a moment in time and a bunch of traders think they know some stuff and they're representing a price of the stock if yes, price of the stock if no, if they think that the decision will be made by someone who knows more than they do, then they have to ask what the decision would imply that they don't already know. And that can produce a bias in the estimates they give. That is, their best information could be to say that no is the right answer, where in fact the prices say yes, because hey, if the decision is yes, that will have meant something that we didn't see. So that's a real problem, but it's straightforwardly solved either by making the market be directly in control and then making sure there's a clear decision time. Because if you had a long window you were averaging over, then early in that window, you would worry about what you might know later in the window, and that would be a problem. So if you just have a short, clear window when the decision is going to happen, you don't have much information coming out during that window, and then the market's in charge, that's one solution. Another solution is the market's advisory, but whoever's making the decision, they or the proxies are allowed to trade in the market and encouraged to, so that the market knows everything. So basically the way to think about combinatorial prediction markets, if you have these n markets, the 2 to the n space, you just think about each state as a separate asset, and each state has a separate price, and everything you're doing can be thought of in terms of each of the prices of each state and the asset each person has for each state. What you really want to do is just have the conditional assets be traded. So you have for sure trades of conditional things. That's the right way to do conditional markets, basically. So for example, I have a stock and I have cash, and I split the cash into cash if CEO stays, cash if CEO leaves, and I've split the stock into stock if CEO stays and stock if CEO leaves. And now one market is trading stock if CEO stays for cash if CEO stays, and the other market is trading stock if CEO leaves for cash if CEO leaves. And now those trades are trades that you're making for sure. Those trades never need to be undone. It's just that one of those set of assets just will become worthless at the end of the decision-making period, because we'll either have the CEO stay or leave. And therefore, we don't ever have to undo any trades. But the key thing is, say you've got 5 decision options, you have $100. You can use the same $100 on all options. And then whichever option actually turned out to be true, your trades on that one will affect your final payoff and the others won't. You get to reuse the same assets across mutually exclusive conditions.
You have a vision for the potential of prediction markets. What's the reality? How do you feel? Are you excited? Are you bullish? Are you bearish?
Well, as you can see, we've suddenly in the last year or two had a lot of burst of activity. And if that's allowed to continue, that will lower infrastructure costs, set legal precedents, get customers familiar with things. That'll all be good unless it produces a backlash, which it could.
Morning is Minnesota banning prediction markets. You see why, right? Is because to the general public, when they think of prediction markets, they don't think decision theory. They think sports betting.
Right. But when they think of ordinary financial markets, they should also be thinking of sports betting. as you may know, pretty much all familiar financial markets were once illegal as gambling. And then what happened is we carved out exceptions. We said, oh, but this has a use, and then we're not going to call it gambling anymore. But it really is. All financial markets really, you can gamble in them. We're just call it something different. So it's about whether people accept something as having a value or not. And once upon a time, we were pretty prudish about lots of things, including gambling, but our world today is much less prudish than it was a century ago. So the question is just how prudish it's going to be about even sports betting, because we allow many kinds of sexual activity, many kinds of hobbies. We just allow a pretty wide range of things for people to do to have fun. And so that'll be a question here. So we might just allow a lot, or we might have a retrenchment where we say, okay, no sports betting. You have to show that there's some other social value to the topic. That would be okay with me because I'm mainly focused on the other social value. But what I fear is they will just squash the best. So as you may know, people had some markets on foreign affairs and even military operations. And then the Kalshi and Poly market, I think both announced policies. They're not going to have markets on important topics of military operations because that's something people are not losing. Now we're losing real information there, right? If you ban the sports markets, I will think, okay, you're just preventing people from having fun, but there wasn't that much social value in the information there. But if you prevent markets about military operations, now you are actually interfering with our ability to hedge risks and to share information.
In your mind, what's the difference between speculation and gambling?
Gambling is just this general capacity to take risks. And it's done for many different reasons, but you might think of speculation as sort of a fun game of proving yourself and trying to win at a challenging game. I mean, people gamble. You say, well, people play poker. Is that gambling? Sort of. If you put your thing on the roulette wheel, you're not really doing that much skill. You're just trying to have some action, some entertainment, some variation. But if you're playing poker, you're more trying to say, I think I can win at this. I think I have a skill. I'm going to try to prove myself. And that's often what people are doing with speculative markets too.
Yes. So this, because again, it's a very important question right now, both in public policy and in the courts, right? Is that what's the line between speculation and gambling?
I think as a matter of fact, that's not what the dispute is hanging on. I think just what fundamentally happened was some new regulatory things allowed a lot more things to happen. A bunch of other people go, ick, I don't like that. And now they're looking for ways to shut it down. And they are just opportunistically looking for whatever complaints they could make that would resonate with people to shut it down. But the fact that it's gambling isn't actually the main thing they're going with at the moment. I think the main thing they're going with is just, oh, some people's secrets are being leaked. And now all of a sudden we're really prudish about secrets. So in that terminology, I would say, think of this as an information institution like journalism and hold it to similar standards and realize it'll have similar problems. So journalism, as you may know, entices people to reveal secrets they had promised to keep. And many of our most famous lauded journalism stories were cases where organizations' secrets leaked as a result of journalists trying to penetrate that. I would say somebody proposed a bill recently saying government employees shouldn't be allowed to bet in the markets because they might reveal secrets that way. I'd say, okay, fine. Don't let them talk to reporters because they might reveal secrets that way. Just have a similar policy across different information institutions in terms of your concern that secrets might be leaked. But for journalism, people don't seem that worried that secrets are sometimes revealed. It also works for things like sabotage. That is, people have in fact changed the world in order to get better press coverage on things. People have tried to say things misleading, offer misleading reports or testimony in order to mislead journalism. And so those similar things are also going to happen in the markets. People will try to mislead them. They will try to change the world in order to get payoffs in the markets.
We've solved them and we're comfortable with the way we solved them with journalism. You're right. There's no reason to treat prediction markets worse than the other informational institutions society relies upon.
I think it's also just worth mentioning, we're talking about revealing secrets. A century ago, U.S. stock regulators decided to ban insider trading by stock owners. So I did a thing where me and a colleague were trying to get people to tell us about cases where they had information they traded on so we could try to develop tools, especially for that kind of customer. And we said, here, we'll pay you $200 an hour to just tell us your war stories from decades ago. And nobody would tell us anything because everybody's scared of being accused of insider trading. So the whole financial world is just terrified of in any way acknowledging any way they had information they traded on. But the fact is, when companies make public announcements and the price moves, half of that move happens before the announcement, and half of that is probably insider trading. So insider trading is actually rampant through financial markets. That's just a fact of existing financial markets. So if you find some example of insider trading and prediction markets, say, oh my, we couldn't allow prediction markets to happen because look, insider trading might happen. I'm saying, look, that's just the world you have in financial markets today.
One of the things that the head of the Good Judgment Project brought up this morning is the fact that nonprofit prediction markets like the University of Iowa were more accurate during the last election cycle than Kalshi and Poly market. What's your hypothesis as to why that's the case?
I'm an economics professor and I'm just happy to see competition. I don't need to have an opinion. If I can just have competition, I'll try and let the best ones win. I have literature like in hospitals or schools, which is better, nonprofit schools and hospitals or for-profit schools and hospitals. You could do that for grocery stores. I'm going to say, I don't need to have an opinion on which is better. I'll just let the world allow both forms and see which ends up outcompeting the others. They each have different pluses and minuses, but why do I need an opinion?
Minnesota just banned prediction markets. Does that apply to the University of Iowa?
That's a question for them to decide. Look, but a key thing we know about, say, with hospitals, for example, is that nonprofit sector grows slower when there is growth opportunities. For-profit sector can just grow much faster in terms of when there are growth opportunities because capital can flow in for-profit ventures much more quickly than it does for nonprofits. So that's at least one of the differences I could point out is that, of course, money can flow out faster too. Maybe nonprofits don't shrink as fast. But the point is, for-profit and nonprofit do have different characteristics in terms of how capital responds to changes in industry conditions.
Do you think it'll be easier to convince the government to let those kind of geopolitical markets happen outside of a for-profit context? Unfortunately, the DARPA project was nonprofit and they still shut it down.
I think just public opinion is pretty random and incoherent. So you really can't make very reliable predictions about how that'll play out. That's just the fact of we're in a democracy. The public opinion runs things, but the public just doesn't think about things very deeply or very coherently. So that gives a lot of room for framing, which is why people try so hard to frame these things when they have potential reaction. And that's what's happening now with prediction markets. That people are struggling very hard to produce surface level framings that will produce emotional engagement. And it isn't very much about sort of the deep structure or rationale of things. It's about finding scandals, basically, or figureheads or iconic images. That's what much of marketing, especially in politics, is about.
Obviously, these prediction market cases are going to end up in the Supreme Court, right? What would you want the Supreme Court to understand about prediction markets when they make a decision about how they should be regulated?
I would like them to treat different information institutions similarly. And I would like them to sort of focus on the social value in terms of if you're willing to see these as information institutions, then you'd want more protection for the parts that are more information valuable. So for example, in the literature on free speech, standard Supreme Court rulings have said, well, it's especially important to have free speech about topics closer to politics and policy. The Supreme Court has said, look, alcohol companies are just not allowed to advertise the fact that people who drink zero are typically less healthy. They've just banned them from saying that. That's just a free speech right that the alcohol companies don't have. And they've said, well, that's because this isn't very important for politics or policy. Therefore, so we can just crush their free speech rights. But when we have other things that are closer to politics and policy, then they're much more reluctant to interfere. So I would say the rationale for these markets as an information rationale, free speech rationale should apply. The closer they get to politics and policy, the more you should give them a space. So for example, we have a standard ruling that protests, which do disrupt traffic and the activity a lot, big protests on the street, they have a free speech protection because it's claimed that they can produce information that you can't get in other ways about people's feelings about politics. Well, speculative betting markets also can give you information that you can't get in other ways. There's things you can say through a betting market that you just can't say in a letter to the editor. And that would similarly be a reason to give it special protection because if it's closer, at least to politics and policy, we have this free speech rationale where we allow a great many things. It's a direct application. It's directly free speech. It's speech, and it should be free for exactly the usual reasons.
And the closer it is to policy-making decisions, the more protected it should be. What else would you want the Supreme Court to know?
I guess there's also just that there is social value in fun. That is, our world today is just much less prudish than it used to be. And we are much more, at least on many social sort of things, willing to let people make choices for themselves about things. And so ask yourself, how important is it as a public policy thing to prevent people people from having the fun they want, even if you don't actually see the other value they might be getting out of it. I started in this area 40 years ago. The standard regulatory framework was that the main justification for financial markets was hedging risk. And therefore, small markets were just not valuable because even though they might produce information, that wasn't an official rationale for speculative markets. And so I would hope that by now we could say, no, the information generated is a substantial important value to be traded against other things directly. So you should justify allowing markets on the information itself, not just on the hedging. Actually, one key thing to think about is manipulation. One concern people have about all information institutions is that people might participate in them in order to distort their output. So you might say misleading things to a reporter in order to distort the story they would tell. Speculative markets, compared to other information institutions, are especially robust to manipulation of this sort. That's a key fact to know about how they're different. Because in fact, our best theory and evidence is that when people are known to be trying to manipulate some market price, that makes the price more accurate than if they weren't being known to try to manipulate it. Yes, exactly. So that's a key thing, nice thing to know, because many people have been worried, if you allow this and then they're important, then they'll be manipulated and they'll be misled and that will be bad. Well, that's an argument about journalism in general. It's sabotage, not manipulation. So for example, let's say you have a prediction market on a project deadline. Will we make a deadline? Now, a potential problem is that people on the project might say, it's going to be harder to make this project more likely make the deadline, but I have a lot of ways to make it less likely to make the deadline. I could sabotage the project and then I could bet in these markets to profit from that, right? So that's a way in which you might induce sabotage by having a betting market in the deadline. But even if someone says, look, you have a problem and you're not going to make it and warns you about it by lowering the price, you might respond to that by fixing the project and taking their advice seriously, but then punishing them for it because they bet you wouldn't make the project and now you do. One is, the person who wants to know about my project, they should have conditional markets. If I don't change policy, what's the chance I'll make the deadline? But then if I change scope, if I change who's participants, then for each of those choices, I want different estimates about what the chance of making the deadline is. And then in addition, you want everybody associated with the project just to have positive stake that they can't bet below zero, which is straightforward to do. So those are two straightforward ways to deal with sabotage in the context of, say, a deadline market. And so the point is, these are potential issues, but we have straightforward ways to deal with it.
So in closing, if you had to handicap it, right, when it gets to the Supreme Court, what are the odds you think prediction markets survive?
I think the major risk is the next Congress, which will then have maybe both houses controlled by Democrats or the next Democratic president. That I think is the major risk, right? I actually don't think the Supreme Court is a risk point in the near future. At that point, the question is how entrenched will they be by then? And how mad can you keep people? So I think the opponents have made this bet that they can make a lot of people mad now and get a lot of press and attention and maybe pass something in Minnesota or whatever. But the question is, will that be able to sustain itself until this next opportunity of when, say, Democrats control Congress or the presidency? And my guess is they've kind of blown it in the sense they won't be able to sustain that passion that long. Voters are fickle in their attention and passions, and they will just get distracted onto other things.
Well, Robin, thank you so much for coming today. I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to announce our internal prediction market.
I am excited. I would certainly be happy to help you if you want to talk about how to structure it in issues.
I'll reach out to you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.